We often picture the Mongol Empire as the product of one man's sheer will. The standard historical narrative paints Genghis Khan as a solitary military genius, riding across the steppes at the head of a fiercely patriarchal society. But the only surviving account, written by the Mongols themselves, a document known as the Secret History of the Mongols, tells a completely different story. In 1184 CE, a young Genghis Khan, then still known as Temujin, faced a crisis with his sworn blood brother and rival, Jamukha. Instead of issuing commands to his generals, he explicitly sought out his mother, Hö'elün, and his senior wife, Börte, to ask them what he should do. Börte didn't hesitate. She bluntly told him to pack up the camp and abandon his blood brother in the middle of the night. Temujin followed her instructions without asking a single question. This was a common occurrence. Women on the Mongol steppe possessed immense political authority. That influence came with a strict, unwritten rule about exactly how they were allowed to use it. Genghis Khan did not conquer the world by himself. To understand how the Mongols actually built their empire, we have to look at the rigid spectrum of female power and what happened to the women who broke its rules. This chart outlines the formal taxonomy of Mongol female authority identified in the historical records. It breaks down into 4 specific types, starting with the most culturally revered tier, the Great Mothers. A Great Mother was an archetype assigned to a woman who achieved supreme status, specifically by raising future leaders without a husband present. Her authority derived from her absolute sacrifice and her control over her male children. This role commanded immense cultural respect. Years later, when Genghis Khan prepared to execute his own brother, his mother, Hö'elün, stormed into his tent and flashed her breasts at him, loudly reminding him of the milk that kept him alive. Genghis Khan backed down immediately. Below the Great Mothers was the second tier of authority, the political wives. The prime examples of this were Genghis Khan's senior wife, Börte, and the daughters she raised. As Genghis expanded his borders, he systematically married his daughters off to the leaders of rival clans. He sent explicit instructions commanding his daughters to take over executive control of those tribes, often forcing their new husbands to dismiss all other wives. Great Mothers and political wives effectively ran the empire's shadow government. They issued orders, managed logistics, and directed foreign policy, safely because their absolute authority was technically shielded behind the title of their sons they birthed or the men they married. Imperial expansion had a brutal cost, and it created a third, deeply restricted category, hostage wives. These were high-status women taken from conquered nations. Her marriage to a Mongol leader served as a physical embodiment of her people's defeat, forcing her into a highly precarious position. Consider the Tartar sisters, Yasugin and Yisu. They were taken as wives by Genghis Khan immediately after he ordered the slaughter of nearly every male relative in their tribe. Despite their devastating circumstances, the sisters figured out how to use the small amount of localized influence they had within the camp. They carefully manipulated their household duties to protect the few surviving young boys of their natal clan, shielding them as kitchen servants. Even when stripped of formal agency and treated as literal spoils of war, these women understood the rigid social hierarchy well enough to navigate it and ensure the strategic survival of their people. Finally, there were the boundary pushers of the empire, the Empress Regents, historically categorized as domineering rulers. The most infamous was Töregene Khatun, who ruled the empire alongside her closest confidant, Fatima, a formerly enslaved Muslim woman who had risen to massive prominence within the court. Töregene and Fatima committed a fatal transgression against steppe culture. Instead of using a male figurehead as a shield for their decisions, they ruled directly. They issued public commands and aggressively raised taxes in their own names. The political system's response to this display of unmediated female authority was swift and severe. Male relatives and court officials moved to violently dismantle their control. Fatima was accused of witchcraft, tortured, and executed through horrific sexualized violence. Her closest ally, Töregene, died suddenly shortly after. The Mongol Empire was perfectly willing to be governed by women, but it would violently destroy any woman who refused to maintain the illusion that a man was in charge. This map shows the geographical scale of the Mongol Empire at its height, stretching across Eurasia. Looking at this vast territory, it's clear it wasn't held together by a single man on a horse. It was stitched together by an intricate web of political marriages. The physical reality of the empire relied on massive mobile camp cities, known as ordus. These massive mobile camps fueled the entire Mongol war machine, and they were managed, organized, and sustained entirely by women. A patriarchal lens obscures these operational realities. Centering the narrative on a few famous men marginalizes women and provides a flawed understanding of how the empire actually functioned on a daily basis. The largest contiguous land empire in human history was built on the backs of its women. They were the true architects, mastering, manipulating, and dying to challenge the hidden rules of power.